The night sky shimmered with an unnatural light, a faint streak of silver cutting through the heavens before vanishing beyond the horizon. To anyone watching from the ground, it might have looked like a shooting star, a fleeting wish in the endless expanse of space. But it wasn't. It was something far stranger, something that didn't belong. Two figures emerged in the middle of a secluded forest clearing, the kind of place humans rarely ventured after dark. The air around them shimmered briefly before settling, as though the universe itself was adjusting to their sudden arrival. They looked almost human at first glance, their features delicate, their movements precise. But there was something unmistakably alien about them. Their eyes were too bright, glowing faintly in the moonlight, and their skin seemed to catch the light in a way that made them look almost ethereal. The taller one brushed dirt off her sleek uniform with an irritated sigh, her expression a mix of frustration and disbelief. "Of all the places," she muttered, her voice carrying edge that matched the sharpness in her gaze. "Why here? What's the point of this?" Her companion, slightly shorter and visibly less confident, looked around with wide, curious eyes. She didn't share the same frustration. Instead, there was a quiet awe in the way she observed the towering trees and the soft glow of fireflies. "Maybe that's the point," she said softly, "to understand why they live like this." The taller one scoffed, crossing her arms. "It's not about understanding. It's punishment. Exile. They want us to feel small." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of whatever had led them to this moment. Punishment. Exile. They had been cast out of their world, sent to this strange and primitive planet to serve out a sentence they didn't fully understand. Their crime? Disobedience. In their advanced society, where every action was dictated by logic and order, they had dared to defy the rules. And now, this Earth was their prison. Their arrival hadn't gone unnoticed, though they didn't know it yet. A few miles away, in a small, sleepy town, a young man was gazing at the same sky, his mind drifting as he tried to forget the monotony of his day. He had always felt out of place here, as though he was meant for something more, something extraordinary. But extraordinary things didn't happen in towns like this. Or so he thought. The two alien girls began to make their way through the forest, their movements cautious but graceful. They didn't speak much, their silence filled with an unspoken tension. It was clear they were not friends, not in the way humans understood friendship. They were bonded by circumstance, by the shared burden of their exile, but they couldn't have been more different. The taller one was all sharp angles and hard edges, her every movement deliberate, calculated. She seemed to carry the weight of their punishment on her shoulders, her frustration simmering just beneath the surface. The shorter one, on the other hand, was softer, her curiosity evident in the way she paused to touch the rough bark of a tree or watch the way the moonlight filtered through the leaves. She seemed less concerned with their exile and more fascinated by the world around them. As they walked, the taller one finally broke the silence. "We can't stay in the open," she said. "We need to find shelter. Humans are unpredictable, dangerous." The shorter one tilted her head, considering this. "They're not so different from us," she said. "I've studied them. Their emotions, their connections, they're what make them strong." The taller one snorted. "Emotions make them weak. That's why their civilizations crumble. That's why they fight. Their world is chaos." Their conversation was interrupted by the faint sound of a guitar drifting through the trees. The music was soft, melancholic, and utterly human. The shorter one's eyes lit up with curiosity. "Do you hear that?" she asked, already moving toward the sound. The taller one grabbed her arm, her expression wary. "We shouldn't. It's too risky." But the shorter one pulled free, her determination surprising. "This is why we're here," she said. "To understand." They followed the music, their footsteps nearly silent on the forest floor. It led them to the edge of the trees, where the forest opened up to a small clearing. There, sitting on an old wooden bench, was the source of the music, a young man with dark hair and an air of quiet melancholy. His guitar rested in his lap, his fingers plucking out a tune that seemed to hold the weight of the world. He didn't see them at first, his focus on the strings and the emotions they carried. The shorter one took a step closer, her curiosity getting the better of her. A twig snapped beneath her foot, and the sound broke the spell. The young man's head shot up, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. He didn't scream or run, as the taller one had expected. Instead, he just stared, his expression a mix of confusion and wonder. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice cautious but not unkind. The shorter one opened her mouth to respond, but the taller one stepped in front of her, her posture defensive. "We mean no harm," she said, her tone clipped. "We were lost." The young man studied them for a moment, his gaze lingering on their strange, otherworldly features. "You're not from around here, are you?" The taller one stiffened, but the shorter one smiled softly. "You could say that." The young man set his guitar aside, his curiosity outweighing his caution. "Well, you found the middle of nowhere," he said, gesturing to the forest around them. "Not much here, but it's peaceful." The shorter one took a step closer, her eyes filled with questions she didn't know how to ask. "Why do you play?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The young man hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I don't know," he admitted. "It helps when things get heavy." The taller one watched the exchange with a mixture of irritation and unease. She didn't trust him, didn't trust this place, but something about the way her companion looked at him made her pause. For the first time since their arrival, she wondered if this exile was about more than punishment. As the young man reached for his guitar again, the taller one caught a movement out of the corner of her eye, a shadow in the trees, too quick to be human. She turned sharply, her senses on high alert. "We're not alone," she said, her voice low and urgent. The young man frowned, following her gaze. "What do you mean?" The taller one didn't answer, her eyes scanning the darkness. The shorter one stepped closer to the young man, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. The music had stopped, and the forest felt suddenly too quiet, the kind of silence that came before something bad. And then, just beyond the tree line, something moved. The shadows lingered at the edge of the clearing, shifting like something alive. The taller girl stood protectively in front of the shorter one, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the tree line. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human that much she could tell. The young man, still seated on the bench, leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed. He could feel the change in the air, the way the temperature seemed to drop just enough to send a shiver down his spine. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice low, as if speaking too loudly might disturb whatever was hiding in the darkness. The taller girl didn't respond immediately. Her gaze darted from shadow to shadow, trying to catch a glimpse of movement, to confirm that she wasn't imagining things. She could feel her companion behind her, the shorter girl's unease radiating like a second pulse. They hadn't been on Earth long, but already it was clear this planet was full of unexpected dangers. "I'm not sure," she said finally, her voice sharp but quiet. "But it's watching us." The young man glanced at her, then at the shorter girl, who seemed more curious than afraid. He didn't know who these girls were or where they had come from, but there was something about them that felt different. Not dangerous, exactly, but otherworldly, in a way he couldn't quite put into words. "Maybe it's just an animal," he suggested, trying to sound calm, though his grip on the edge of the bench betrayed his nerves. The shorter girl tilted her head as if considering his words. "Animals don't feel like this," she said softly. Her glowing eyes flicked toward the shadows, where the faintest rustling sound echoed through the trees. "This is something else." The taller girl's jaw tightened. She didn't want to scare the human they couldn't afford to, but she also didn't want to underestimate whatever was out there. Their exile had been meant to strip them of their privileges, their technology, their protections. Here, they were vulnerable in ways they had never been before. Suddenly, the rustling grew louder, closer. The young man shot to his feet, his heart pounding. He scanned the darkness, his eyes darting from tree to tree, but he couldn't see anything. "All right, this is getting creepy," he muttered, backing toward the girls. "If this is some kind of prank, it's not funny." "It's not a prank," the taller girl said flatly. Her tone left no room for argument. "Stay close." The shorter girl reached out, placing a hand on the young man's arm. Her touch was light, but it stopped him in his tracks. "Don't move," she whispered. "It's testing us." He looked at her, his confusion growing. "What do you mean, testing us? What is it?" She didn't answer. Instead, she closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to sense whatever was out there. The taller girl watched her closely, her expression a mix of concern and annoyance. This wasn't the time for risks, but her companion had always been the curious one, the one who wanted to understand rather than react. The rustling stopped abruptly, plunging the clearing into an eerie silence. The young man's breath caught in his throat. He felt the weight of the stillness pressing down on him, and for a moment it was as if the world itself had paused. Then, without warning, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was humanoid in shape, but wrong in all the ways that mattered. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, like liquid poured into the shape of a person. Its eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow that seemed to pierce the darkness. The young man froze, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The taller girl stepped forward, placing herself squarely between the creature and the others. "Stay back," she ordered, her voice steady despite the tension in her posture. She didn't know what this thing was, but it was clear it wasn't here by chance. It had been drawn to them, and that meant it was a threat. The creature tilted its head, studying her with an unsettling intensity. Then it spoke, not in words, but in a sound that resonated deep in their minds, a low, pulsing hum that carried an unspoken meaning. The young man clutched his head, wincing as the sound seemed to drill into his thoughts. The shorter girl stepped closer, her expression softening. "It's communicating," she said, her voice almost gentle. "It doesn't mean harm." The taller girl shot her a glare. "You don't know that." The creature's hum grew louder, more insistent. Images began to flash in the young man's mind: stars, distant planets, a vast, empty void that stretched on forever. He staggered back, overwhelmed, but the shorter girl caught him before he could fall. "It's showing us something," she said, her voice barely audible. "It's searching." "Searching for what?" the taller girl snapped, her patience wearing thin. She didn't trust this creature, and she certainly didn't trust its intentions. Their exile had already made them vulnerable. The last thing they needed was to get tangled up in something they didn't understand. The shorter girl didn't answer. Instead, She turned her attention back to the creature, her glowing eyes meeting its yellow gaze. For a moment, it was as if they were locked in a silent conversation, one that the others couldn't hear. The young man watched, his fear slowly giving way to a strange sense of awe. Whatever these girls were, they were unlike anything he had ever encountered. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure: his life would never be the same after this night. The hum faded, and the creature took a step back, its movements slow and deliberate. It tilted its head one last time, as if acknowledging the shorter girl, before retreating into the shadows. The rustling of the trees grew fainter and fainter until it disappeared entirely, leaving the clearing silent once more. The taller girl let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "What was that?" she demanded, her tone sharp as she turned to her companion. The shorter girl hesitated, her gaze lingering on the spot where the creature had vanished. "I think it was looking for something," she said finally. "Or someone." The young man swallowed hard, his mind racing. "Well, whatever it was, let's hope it doesn't come back," he said, trying to inject some humor into his voice, though it came out shaky. "You two are seriously going to have to explain what's going on." The taller girl ignored him, her focus still on her companion. "You shouldn't have engaged with it," she said, her voice low and tense. "We don't know what it wants." "I had to," the shorter girl replied, her tone steady but quiet. "It wasn't here by chance. It was drawn to us. To you." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The young man frowned, looking between them. "Wait, what does that mean? Why would it be looking for you?" Neither of them answered, their silence speaking volumes. The young man felt a knot of unease tighten in his chest. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than he had imagined. And somehow, he was now a part of it. The forest felt heavier now, the weight of the encounter pressing down on all of them. The young man glanced at the girls, his nerves frayed, but he kept his voice steady. "So what happens now?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted an answer. The taller girl ignored him, pacing the clearing like a caged animal. Her focus was razor sharp, her mind running through possibilities. Whatever that creature had been, it wasn't finished with them. She was sure of it. It had left too easily, like it was biding its time. That thought set her on edge. The shorter girl stood still, her gaze lost in the darkness where the creature had disappeared. She seemed calmer, but her calm was unsettling. It wasn't resignation or fear, it was something deeper, as though she knew more than she was letting on. "I don't think it's gone far," she said finally, her voice soft but clear. The taller girl stopped pacing, turning to face her. "What are you talking about? You think it's waiting?" The shorter girl nodded, her expression unreadable. "It didn't find what it was looking for. And it knows we're the key." The young man felt his stomach twist. "The key to what?" he asked, his voice rising despite himself. "Why would something like that be after you?" The shorter girl glanced at him, her glowing eyes flickering in the moonlight. She opened her mouth to speak but hesitated. The taller girl stepped in, her tone cold and guarded. "That's not your concern." "Not my concern?" The young man threw his hands up in disbelief. "You show up out of nowhere. You bring whatever that was. And now you're telling me it's not my problem. I'm the one standing here in the middle of all this." The taller girl bristled, her patience clearly wearing thin. But before she could snap back, the shorter girl raised a hand, her voice calm. "He's right. He's involved now, whether we wanted that or not." The taller girl muttered something under her breath, but didn't argue. Instead, she turned her attention back to the forest, her senses on high alert. The young man took a step closer to the shorter girl, lowering his voice. "Just tell me what's going on. Please. I don't want to be left in the dark." The shorter girl hesitated again, but something in his tone seemed to reach her. She sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "We're not from here," she said simply. "Our people sent us to your planet as punishment. They stripped us of our technology, our resources, everything that made us who we were. But they didn't tell us the whole truth about why we were being sent here." The young man frowned, his mind racing. "So what? That thing was sent after you to finish the job?" The shorter girl shook her head. "I don't think so. It wasn't hostile, not yet. It was searching for something that involves us." The taller girl let out a bitter laugh, crossing her arms. "And you think that's a good thing? That it's just curious?" She shook her head, her voice dripping with frustration. "We're targets, plain and simple. And now he is too." The young man swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. He wanted to argue, to deny it, but deep down he knew she was right. Whatever this was, he was in it now, whether he liked it or not. The silence that followed was thick with tension, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The taller girl's eyes darted around the clearing, searching for any sign of movement. The shorter girl seemed almost meditative, her expression soft but distant. And then it came again. The sound, that low, pulsing hum that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them. The young man flinched, clutching his head as the sound grew louder, more insistent. The shorter girl closed her eyes, her face tightening in concentration, while the taller girl tensed, her stance shifting into something defensive. The hum wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, a force that seemed to fill the clearing. And this time, it didn't stay at the edge of their awareness. It moved closer, pressing in on them from all sides. The young man stumbled back, his breathing shallow. "What's happening?" he managed to choke out, his voice barely audible over the hum. The shorter girl opened her eyes, her glowing gaze locking onto him. "It's testing us again," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "It wants to see what we'll do." The taller girl took a step forward, her hands clenched into fists. "Well, I'm not playing along," she growled. "If it wants us, it'll have to come out and fight." As if in response, the hum shifted, its tone deepening. The air around them seemed to ripple, the clearing blurring at the edges like a mirage. Shapes began to emerge from the distortion, shadows twisting into forms that were almost but not quite human. The young man's heart pounded in his chest. What are those?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The shorter girl didn't answer. Her focus was entirely on the shapes, her expression unreadable. The taller girl, however, let out a low curse. "Projections," she said through gritted teeth. "They're not real. It's trying to confuse us." The shadows moved closer, their features becoming clearer with each step. They looked like people, but their faces were wrong, blurred, shifting, as though they couldn't decide on a single form. The young man felt his legs begin to shake, fear clawing at him. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice trembling. The taller girl didn't hesitate. "We hold our ground," she said firmly. "Whatever this thing is, it wants us to run. We can't give it the satisfaction." The shorter girl glanced at her, a hint of doubt flickering in her eyes. "And if that's what it wants us to think?" she asked quietly. The taller girl didn't answer, her jaw tightening as the projections closed in. The hum grew louder, more overwhelming, until it felt like it was coming from inside their heads. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The projections froze, their forms flickering like a bad signal. The clearing fell silent once more, but the tension didn't ease. The young man looked around, his chest heaving. What just happened? The shorter girl took a cautious step forward, her gaze fixed on the nearest projection. "It's waiting," she said softly. "It wants us to make the next move." The taller girl let out a frustrated growl. "Then let's make it regret waiting." But before she could act, the projections vanished, dissolving into the night like smoke. The clearing was empty again, but the feeling of being watched remained. The young man exhaled shakily, his mind racing. Why does it feel like we just failed some kind of test? The shorter girl didn't respond. She turned to the taller girl, her expression grim. "It's not over," she said. "This was just the beginning." The taller girl nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't say it out loud, but she agreed. Whatever they were dealing with, it wasn't finished with them yet. And whatever came next would be worse. The silence after the projections disappeared was suffocating, each second stretching into eternity. The young man wiped the sweat from his brow, his eyes darting between the two girls. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were balancing on a knife's edge, one wrong move away from plunging into chaos. The taller girl kept her stance rigid, scanning the trees with eyes that seemed to dare whatever force was out there to come back. The shorter girl, though calmer, appeared more troubled than before. Her eyes reflected not just concern, but recognition, like she understood something that the others didn't. Before anyone could speak, a sudden crackle broke the stillness, a sound like electricity snapping through the air. The young man flinched, his heart pounding as a glowing fissure appeared just a few feet away, cutting through the fabric of the night. It stretched wide, humming with an unnatural energy, and through it stepped a figure unlike any of the projections they had seen. This one was real, tangible, and exuded a presence so intense it made the air thick with tension. The figure was tall, draped in a shimmering cloak that shifted colors like oil on water. Its face was partially obscured by a hood, but eyes that gleamed like molten metal peered out, scanning them with a cold, calculating gaze. The young man felt rooted to the spot, fear seizing his limbs. The taller girl's expression turned from wary to fierce, muscles coiling like she was ready to spring into action. The shorter girl took a step back, eyes wide with a mix of shock and recognition. "You weren't supposed to find us," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the low hum of the fissure behind the figure. The figure's eyes locked onto her, and for a moment it seemed as though time itself had stopped. Then it spoke, and the voice that emerged was deep, resonant, and laced with an authority that sent shivers down their spines. "You were never truly hidden," it said. "Not from us." The young man felt his heart thud painfully against his chest. Who is that?" he stammered, glancing between the girls, desperate for answers. The shorter girl's hands trembled as she looked at him, guilt swimming in her eyes. "This is why we were sent here," she said, her voice tight. "To keep us away from them." The taller girl's expression hardened, a spark of defiance lighting up her eyes. "If they've come, it means they think we're a threat," she spat. "And they're not wrong." The figure in the cloak tilted its head slightly, as if amused. "A threat?" it repeated, the word curling in the air like smoke. "No, you're a mistake we intend to correct." The hum of the fissure grew louder, a pulse that seemed to sync with the young man's racing heartbeat. He wanted to run, to pull the girls with him and flee into the safety of ignorance. But deep down, he knew there was no escaping this. The shorter girl stepped forward, her eyes meeting the figures with a strange mix of fear and determination. "You won't take us back," she said, her voice gaining strength. We belong here now. The figure's metallic eyes narrowed. You belong nowhere. Your defiance is futile. The taller girl let out a derisive laugh. Try us, she challenged, her fists glowing faintly with an energy that made the young man's jaw drop. He hadn't seen that before, hadn't known she was capable of it. He realized with a shock that he didn't know anything about what these girls could really do. The figure's cloak rippled as it raised an arm, fingers splayed like claws. The air between them crackled with energy, the clearing suddenly alive with light and sound. The young man shielded his eyes, stumbling back as a blast of force hit him like a wave, sending him sprawling to the ground. The taller girl stood firm, the glow around her hands intensifying as she pushed back against the energy. The shorter girl joined her, their combined force creating a barrier that sparked and shimmered like a living wall. The figure took a step forward, unfazed, its eyes narrowing with concentration. The energy in the clearing shifted, growing denser, pressing down on them like an invisible weight. The young man struggled to catch his breath, his vision blurring as he tried to stand. It was clear now, this wasn't just a confrontation, it was a battle for survival. And then, in the middle of the chaos, a second shockwave erupted, but this one wasn't from the figure. It came from behind, a burst of energy so powerful it shook the ground. The young man's head snapped around just in time to see the source, a blinding, pulsating light that grew and expanded until it seemed to fill the entire clearing. For a moment, everything was white, and the sound was so deafening that it felt like the world had been torn in two. When the light finally dimmed and the noise faded to an echo, the young man gasped for air, blinking spots from his eyes. The figure in the cloak was gone, the fissure sealed, but the clearing was scorched, smoldering in places where the grass had been seared away. The taller girl was on one knee, breathing hard, her face pale but defiant. The shorter girl was beside her, her eyes wide and shining with tears. It started, shorter girl said, her voice barely more than a whisper. This was just the beginning. The young man pushed himself up, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. He looked at the girls, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and grim resolve. Whatever this was, it was bigger than anything he could have imagined. And deep down, he knew there was no going back. The stakes had just been raised, and the real fight was only just beginning. The clearing was silent now, save for the faint crackle of scorched grass. The young man's breathing was shallow, his body trembling from both exhaustion and fear. He glanced between the girls, who stood in stark contrast, one defiant fist still glowing faintly, the other calm but with a deep sadness etched into her features. For a moment, it felt like they had won, like the cloaked figure's retreat was the end. But deep down, they all knew it wasn't over. The taller girl was the first to break the silence. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice firm but tinged with urgency. "That thing will come back, and next time, it won't be alone." The shorter girl didn't respond right away. Her glowing eyes seemed fixed on the spot where the figure had vanished, as though she could still feel its presence lingering in the air. Finally, she turned to the young man. "You should leave," she said softly. "This isn't your fight." The young man shook his head, his voice unsteady but resolute. "I'm already in it. You think I can just walk away after everything I've seen? After everything that's happened?" He looked between them, desperation in his eyes. "I don't even know what's going on, but I'm not letting you face it alone." The taller girl opened her mouth to argue, but the shorter girl placed a hand on her arm, silencing her. "He's right," she said quietly. "He's a part of this now, whether we wanted him to be or not. The taller girl hesitated, her jaw tightening, but eventually she nodded. "Fine," she said, her tone clipped. "But if he's staying, he needs to know the truth." The shorter girl's expression darkened, and she looked away. "The truth won't change anything," she murmured. The young man stepped closer, his voice firmer now. "Then tell me. I deserve to know." The shorter girl took a deep breath, her gaze meeting his. "Our punishment wasn't just exile," she began. "We were sent here because they believed we could never adapt, that this world would break us." She hesitated, her voice faltering. "But there's more. They sent something with us, something meant to ensure we didn't survive." The young man felt his stomach drop. "Teacher," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The taller girl nodded grimly. "It's a fail-safe. If we proved too resilient, it would eliminate us. But something's gone wrong. It's not following orders anymore." The shorter girl's expression softened, a flicker of guilt crossing her face. "It's searching for something," she said. "And I think it might have found it." Before the young man could ask what she meant, the air in the clearing shifted again. The hum returned, louder and more insistent, and the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The young man's pulse quickened as another fissure appeared, this one larger and more unstable. Cloaked figure emerged once more, but it wasn't alone. Behind it, a massive, swirling form began to take shape, its outline flickering with a dark, otherworldly energy. The taller girl stepped forward, her fists glowing brighter. "Get behind me," she ordered, her voice steady despite the fear that flickered in her eyes. The young man hesitated, but the shorter girl grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "She's right," she said. "This isn't something you can fight." The cloaked figure raised its hand, and the swirling form behind it surged forward, a wave of energy crashing toward them. The taller girl threw up a barrier, the force of the impact sending shockwaves through the clearing. The young man stumbled, but the shorter girl caught him, her grip surprisingly strong. "It's stronger than before," the taller girl called out, her voice strained. "I can't hold it for long." The shorter girl's expression hardened, and she stepped forward, her eyes glowing brighter. "Then we end this now," she said, her voice filled with a quiet determination. Before the taller girl could stop her, the shorter girl stepped through the barrier, walking straight toward the cloaked figure. The energy crackled around her, but she didn't falter. The young man's heart raced as he watched her, his instincts screaming for him to intervene, but he knew he couldn't. The cloaked figure tilted its head, its molten eyes narrowing. "You would sacrifice yourself?" it asked, its voice dripping with disdain. The shorter girl stopped a few feet away, her gaze unwavering. "This isn't about me," she said. "It's about breaking the cycle. You don't control us anymore." The figure laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent shivers down the young man's spine. "You think you can defy your nature?" it sneered. "You are what we made you." The shorter girl shook her head, her voice firm. "Not anymore." With that, she raised her hands, and a surge of energy erupted from her, brighter and more powerful than anything the young man had seen. It collided with the swirling form behind the cloaked figure, and for a moment, the entire clearing was consumed by light. When the light faded, the cloaked figure was gone, and the swirling form had dissipated. The shorter girl stood in the center of the clearing, her body trembling but still upright. The taller girl rushed to her side, catching her as she collapsed. The young man hurried over, his heart pounding. "Is she?" he began, but the taller girl cut him off. "She'll be fine," she said, her voice softer now. But this isn't over. The failsafe is gone, but they'll send more. They always do. The shorter girl opened her eyes, a faint smile playing on her lips. Not this time, she whispered. I made sure of it. The taller girl frowned, but before she could ask what she meant, the shorter girl's gaze shifted to the young man. You need to leave, she said weakly. They won't stop hunting us, but you can still be free. The young man shook his head, his eyes filled with determination. I'm not going anywhere, he said firmly. We'll face whatever comes next. Together. The shorter girl's smile widened, and she closed her eyes, exhaustion overtaking her. The taller girl looked at the young man, her expression softening for the first time. You're either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, she said, but there was no malice in her tone. The young man shrugged, a faint smile on his lips. Maybe both, he admitted. As the three of them sat in the clearing, the night around them eerily quiet, the young man couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger. But for now, they had survived, and that was enough. Or, so he thought until he saw the faint glow in the distance, a reminder that the fight was far from over. As they sat in the clearing, silence stretched around them, interrupted only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The air carried a strange calm, though it was tinged with an underlying tension, as if the universe itself held its breath. The taller girl kept her gaze on the faint glow in the distance, her shoulders stiff, ready for whatever might come. The shorter girl, still leaning against her, was pale but peaceful, her breathing steady. The young man couldn't tear his eyes away from them, questions swirling in his mind like a storm. You didn't tell me everything, he said finally, his voice breaking the silence. About why you're here. About why you're fighting so hard to stay. What's really at stake? The taller girl glanced at him, her jaw tightening. She seemed reluctant to answer, but the shorter girl stirred, her eyes fluttering open. He deserves to know, she murmured, her voice barely audible. The taller girl hesitated, then let out a heavy sigh. Fine, she said, her tone clipped. But don't expect it to change anything. She turned to the young man, her eyes sharp. We were sent here because we're different. Not just from you, but from our own people. They fear us because we're not bound by the same rules, the same limitations. They thought sending us here would be enough to contain us. The shorter girl nodded weakly. But Earth changed us. Being here, it taught us things we weren't supposed to learn. Compassion, connection, choice. Her gaze softened as she looked at the young man. They see that as a threat. The young man frowned, trying to piece it all together. So, this whole time, they've been trying to erase you. Because you're evolving? The taller girl let out a humorless laugh. Something like that. But it's not just about us. If they succeed, they'll keep doing it. To anyone, anywhere, who steps out of line. She fixed him with a steely gaze. That's why we can't give up. Even if it means... She trailed off, her voice cracking slightly. The young man nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what they were saying. It wasn't just about survival. It was about standing up against something far greater than themselves. But the glow in the distance was a stark reminder that their fight was far from over. What happens now? He asked, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. The shorter girl smiled faintly. Now we finish it, she said. The taller girl stood, helping the shorter girl to her feet. The young man joined them, his resolve hardening. He wasn't sure what he could do to help, but he knew he couldn't turn his back on them now. Together, they began walking toward the glow, the night swallowing them in its vast embrace. The journey was silent, each step heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. The closer they got, the more the glow grew, until it wasn't just light but a palpable energy that made the air hum around them. The young man felt his heart hammering in his chest, but he kept moving, driven by the unshakable determination of the girls beside him. When they reached the source, the sight took his breath away. A massive, pulsating structure stood before them, shimmering with an otherworldly light. It seemed to pulse with life, each beat sending waves of energy rippling through the air. The cloaked figure stood at its base, waiting for them, its molten eyes gleaming with cold triumph. "You should have stayed hidden," it said, its voice echoing unnaturally. The taller girl stepped forward, her fists glowing brighter than ever. "We're done hiding," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. The shorter girl moved to stand beside her, her own energy flickering to life. "This ends here," she said, her tone quiet but firm. The figure tilted its head, as if amused. "You truly believe you can defy us?" it sneered. The young man stepped forward, surprising even himself. "They're not alone," he said, his voice shaking but strong. "And if you're so powerful, why are you afraid of them?" The figure's eyes narrowed, but it didn't respond. Instead, it raised its hand, and the structure behind it began to pulse faster, the glow intensifying. The ground beneath them trembled, and the air grew thick with tension. The battle that followed was unlike anything the young man could have imagined. The girls fought with a ferocity and grace that seemed almost otherworldly, their energy clashing with the figures in a dazzling display of light and sound. The young man did what he could, dodging blasts of energy and searching for any way to help. At one point, he spotted a weak point in the structure, a small, flickering panel that seemed out of sync with the rest. Without thinking, he rushed toward it, ignoring the chaos around him. He reached the panel and slammed his fist against it, the impact sending a jolt of pain through his arm. The structure shuddered, its glow faltering, and the cloaked figure let out a furious roar. The girls seized the opportunity, their combined energy surging forward in a final, devastating attack. The blast hit the figure squarely, and it let out a piercing scream before disintegrating into nothingness. The structure collapsed in on itself, the energy dissipating into the night. The clearing was silent once more, the air still and heavy with the aftermath of the battle. The young man turned to the girls, his heart pounding. "Did we?" he began, but the taller girl cut him off with a nod. "It's over," she said, her voice soft but firm. The shorter girl smiled weakly, her energy fading as she collapsed to her knees. The young man rushed to her side, catching her before she could fall. "You're okay," he said, his voice thick with relief. "We did it." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with both exhaustion and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, "for staying." The taller girl joined them, her expression softening as she looked at her companion. "You were amazing," she said quietly. The shorter girl managed a small smile. "We all were," she said. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, the three of them sat together, the weight of their victory settling in. The fight was over, but their journey was far from finished. There were still questions to answer, wounds to heal, and a world to protect. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough. The young man looked at the girls, his heart swelling with a strange mix of pride and hope. They had faced the impossible and come out stronger for it. And whatever came next, he knew they would face it together. The sun rose higher, bathing the clearing in warm light. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the world seemed peaceful, if only for a moment. And in that moment, they allowed themselves to simply be three unlikely allies bound by a shared fight and an unbreakable bond.